you know, one of the characteristics of the great proletarian cultural revolution was the destruction of antiquities and the burning of books. You know, most of my friends at the university had been Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution and would describe to me, for example, how they went to the 10,000 Buddha mountain outside Nanjing and using axes chopped the Buddhist icons off the mountain and destroyed them. And when I was a student, I brought some old guidebooks to China and would seek out famous sites of the past, temples and so on. And often, you know, I'd climb up a mountain and I'd find the temple practically still smoldering. You know, it was still there. The charred remains of the structure were still there. After the reform and opening, I was able to obtain a lot of quite a large quantity of ancient Chinese books for a song, and these were books that had been stolen from intellectuals, and instead of being burnt, had been put into storage, and then when the movement ended, they couldn't return them to the original owners, not having any record of that, and sold them over a period of about a month on the market. So I have some very nice editions of ancient Chinese texts that I feel a little bit guilty about, as you know, they belonged to somebody who had them taken away. I was, at the time of the trial of the Gang of Four, Chairman Mao's wife and close associates, you know, there weren't many televisions available at that time, and I was invited by a friend that I'd met in Fudan, who wasn't a student, but he lived in the dormitory with his mom, and to come up and watch the daily broadcasts of little snippets of the trial. Sometimes you'd get 20 minutes, sometimes you'd get 5, in their apartment on a 9-inch black and white television. So they sat me down in a comfortable bamboo chair. And then it occurred to me, to my horror, that I was sitting in the chair of this gentleman's father who had committed suicide as a result of persecution in the movement. And every evening I was coming and enjoying some snacks and tea with the widow and son that had been left behind. It was, of course, they were taking a lot of satisfaction out of the trial and maybe inviting, you know, one of the few foreigners around to attend and sit in that chair gave them some form of satisfaction, but I had a lot of unease about it. But of course, I kept coming.
I think, I mean, this traumatic time, it might be too much of a stretch to ask, but it just occurs to me. How do you think the current generations that you knew and have studied ever since then, was there some kind of traumatic effect of having to gone through this that has made change or influence the way that the Chinese people think?
One of my closest friends passed away last year, had been a major target of attack in the Cultural Revolution. He was a professor of mathematics at Fudan University, and his family had been wealthy capitalists in the textile trade. His father was the youngest brother, and all the rest of the family left for Taiwan and America, Hong Kong. His father was left behind to oversee what was left of the family assets. And he was subject to every campaign that came along, particularly the anti-rightist campaign of 1957. And then the Cultural Revolution, he lost his property, was confiscated. He ended up working in construction as part of his re-education. He wasn't able to continue with math. And he was imprisoned in the dormitory at Fudan University, where he was subject to physical and psychological torture by the young revolutionary professors. Then when the Cultural Revolution ended and he was I was actually present at his home when the police came to announce that he had been rehabilitated. And basically 2 policemen showed up and said, we've reviewed your files and none of the charges against you are valid, and you are now rehabilitated. And he did get back some of his property. And then he resumed work. The young revolutionary teachers who replaced the real professors when the university was reopened in the latter phase of the Cultural Revolution had to take a qualifying exam, and if they passed the qualifying exam, they were allowed to remain as teachers in the university. Most of them did not pass and left, had to leave the campus. I remember there was a demonstration by them protesting their being expelled as so-called professors. So I said to him, in department meetings, you're sitting next to the same people who had physically abused you during your incarceration period. How can you function? And he said, well, we were all part of it. And he felt that his period being in the countryside, where he was sent down to labor in the fields for some time before he got the construction job, he had become aware of conditions for ordinary people. It wasn't completely without some value. And he said, well, they were all young and they know better now, and so on. So, I mean, it was an extraordinarily broad-minded approach to these people. The people that he felt resentment towards were the university officials who had been instrumental in his persecution, who never apologized and whose careers continued to rise. And there was never any kind of truth and reconciliation over this. And to the end of his life, I think he still felt resentment that there'd been no, the 2 policemen coming was one thing, but no real sort of acknowledgement that he had been wronged, and that it impacted, of course, on his daughter, who didn't enjoy the benefit of her parents' care while they were in the countryside and so on. And then, of course, there was, because of the economic disruption, so many young people, after graduating high school, were sent to the border areas to open up border regions. And it was dangerous, particularly for the women, the young women, quite a lot of sexual abuse. And I remember, I think it was Spring Festival 1979, the Shanghai, what they referred to as intellectual youth, were allowed to return to Shanghai for the first time in years to celebrate Chinese New Year with their families. And there was a demonstration. They did a march from the People's Square, and former race course in Shanghai, to the former Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which was the Revolutionary Committee, the municipal government. And they were holding up posters. And one poster that particularly touched me, it just had 4 characters on it. 还我青春, which means give me back my youth. And those people, were never able to get proper employment because they'd missed the opportunity for education. So, they were the permanent victims of poor policy.
10 years in particular.
I think, I've taken the cue from the people in China that I have been so close to over the years, my former roommates and classmates and so on, who have educated me not to be readily flim-flammed by propaganda which is directed abroad, and the propaganda directed by the regime internally, that all of them understand is not reflective of anything that they can believe in. And so I think after the disappointment of the Tiananmen massacre, they renewed political reform in the years, renewed political reform initiatives in the year afterwards. In other words, the promise that China would be getting into compliance with universal norms of citizenship and human rights. You know, statements at the National People's Congress by prime ministers that this is something that China is working towards. After a while, this started to wear fairly thin with my Chinese friends, and they became quite cynical about China's political future. And then when Xi Jinping came in, it became much, much worse. And we have a situation today where I really think that you're hard-pressed to find anyone that feels that Xi Jinping is a great Chinese leader. His rule seems to be basically based on suppression of dissent, and you know, with the decline in the economy and the increasing repression of freedom of expression, you know, people are feeling more and more disappointed in Chinese politics and China's role in the world. I mean, it's a very, you know, it's a very interconnected kind of thing. And I have a close friend who works for a Chinese television station producing dramas. And, you know, before Mr. Xi, they felt that they were producing television serials that had some artistic integrity to them, and they felt proud of their work. And, you know, if they produced a good serial, then they attracted more advertising dollars to the TV station, which meant that they received better bonuses at the end of the year and had more funds to do their production of these TV dramas. Then when Xi came in, strictures came down demanding a much more politicized television content. So the result was that they had to produce highly political dramas. The upshot was that the people aren't interested in watching that on TV. The advertising dollars went down. The funding for them to produce these second-rate political pieces went down, and there was no money for their bonuses at the end of the year. So, you know, it has a sort of cascading effect. It's not just that you can completely ignore the Xi policies. They actually impact negatively on people in every aspect. And the, you know, the fear of the Xi crackdown on corruption and ethics, which is largely politically oriented, has caused people who might have entrepreneurial ideas to sit quiet and not do anything for fear that they will be had up for tax evasion or bribery or whatever, which, you know, is necessary parts of the business culture in China. So you see a general malaise over society, and a real desire for China to open up and for the country to become free again. But this is very much in the you know, in the underground culture, and increasingly kept away from most public view. I feel privileged to be sufficiently trusted to be privy to these kinds of conversations, but people are just feeling discouraged, and I think that, you know, the result could be an explosion once the pressure builds up, and maybe as people recognize that under Xi the economy is going to continue to decline, and that he's not going to open up the society, and that his foreign adventurism is resulting in negative economic impacts inside China. And of course the prospect of a war, which I think a lot of Chinese don't support, the idea of a kinetic war over Taiwan or the South China Sea. I mean, I certainly find myself having to repeat things. You know, sometimes I feel like Chuck Berry playing the same songs and the same riffs over and over again. You know, it's sort of like I feel sometimes like, you know, I wrote that thing. It's like doing a painting, you know, once you've painted it, you put it on the wall and don't paint it again. But people keep urging me to continue to write and try and keep the discourse alive. I do think that, particularly in recent years, particularly after the start of the release of the classified documents, that there are a lot of people who are writing, you know, my kind of opinion pieces. Many of them, like say Terry Glavin, writing them with much more aplomb and good language, and expressing things in ways that perhaps I couldn't or wouldn't myself. So I take some encouragement that I'm not as isolated as I was. And really, for a very long time, I think I was really the only person publishing in the Globe and Mail who was writing that kind of article. And now we're seeing a lot more by you know, authoritative Canadian voices. But I do continue to produce, I would say, maybe 13 or 15 pieces a year. Certainly not up to, you know, the output of professional journalists, but I'm busy doing a lot of other things. And I like to write when I feel I have something to say. And so it's not really a deadline appears and I write something. It really is a question that myself or my editor, Kevin Kavanagh, decide that let's get something out on this, and then I produce the 800 words or so and put it in the paper. I must say, I've never had anything not published. I mean, everything I produce ends up somewhere, not always in the Globe and Mail, but I've been fortunate that there always seems to be an outlet prepared to take my pieces.
Last question, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the absolute worst, how would you judge the CCP threat to Canada?
Oh, I mean, increasing. I mean, I'm not sure, you know, how one could characterize a threat as not a great threat. It's potentially an enormous threat because they put so much resources into it. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party United Front Work Department has more resources and personnel assigned to it than the entire Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that excludes the large number of agents of the Chinese Ministry of State Security who are operating in our country. So I really see this as the primary threat of our times, and I think that this perspective is shared by you know, statements from the director of CSIS and the director of the CSE and others. But people, they say this, but it doesn't seem to penetrate sufficiently that people take it as something that requires urgent and forceful response. We're not seeing, you know, the kind of reallocation of national resources to our intelligence and security agencies that would allow us to be anywhere equal to the amount of resources that the Chinese regime is putting into their espionage and influence operations. And this troubles me. It just seems that, you know, maybe everyone would agree with what Mr. Vigneault, the former director of CSIS, says, but nobody seems to think that it's necessary to actually reallocate national resources to respond to it.
I have a question from Dean Baxendale that need you to ask Charles about his upcoming book, A Book of Columns. Can you maybe give us a comment about this book and what it is? And
yes, I'm looking forward to seeing a collection of 60 selected columns of the over 200 that I have published since 2005 or 6, I think. I'm hoping that going back over these columns will give us some insight into how Canada got into the mess that we've gotten into, and perhaps some lessons that we can learn going forward in the present and into the future. You know, these things tend to be forgotten the day after they're published, and it took me and my editor Kevin Kavanagh quite a bit of time to track them all down, but we have done that, and the book should be coming out later on in 2025, and I hope that it's a book that people will like to read. I think, aside from it being a sort of encyclopedic summary of work I've done, I think there'll be a lot of the human interest story in there about my own deepening understanding of China and my own, I guess, amazement at how the Chinese regime successively is able to become more and more deeply implicated into Canadian economy and politics and security. Often when I hear a report, say of the Uyghur genocide, or the national security law in Hong Kong, or the number of parliamentarians and their staff who CSIS is identified as being, to some degree or other, beholden to China, my initial response is always, surely that can't be true. And it turns out that it always seemed to be worse than I could ever have imagined. And so I think the book will be picking up on some of that kind of emotion in my life.